trying to actually do an interview now with Rocky, and of course now we've all trying to look at the iPad over here, so it's like the camera might go drifting over this way. So.
iPod trumps Rocky.
Yeah, which is more popular, Rocky or iPad? Rocky.
Come on, the iPad trumps all of us.
Rocky holding an iPad.
Nice. So if I have to do this interview right here, looking at, you'll come back. All right. I'll try to stay focused on you. So, you're Rocky, and it's all fun and games until someone writes bad code. So does CSLA fix that?
Sure, absolutely. and the first step in doing that is to get an iPad.
CSLA programming on the iPad.
That actually is not likely to happen given Apple's decision to block everybody from programming.
Unless you do CSLA and Objective-C.
Yeah, because that's going to happen just real soon now.
So, speaking of CSLA, and probably what fixes everything is CSLA 4, which is that official release now, or is it almost released?
No, it's actually still a work in progress, but there's a pretty current pre-release available.
Okay, so what are some of the key features that are coming up with CSLA 4? And what I also have to say is, I've now been on a project for the last 6 months, so we've used CSLA 3.8, and I actually have to say I've always been ambivalent. Now I've got a much better feeling for it, primarily because I think there's things in there that have made it easier, and you don't have to do as much as you had to before. So what's coming in 4 that's going to make things even easier and better?
Well, I suppose the obvious one is that it works with .NET 4 and Silverlight 4, and hence all of the 4, right? Keep the numbers in sync.
Okay.
But really the focus is to continue to do what you just said, which is to make things simpler. I guess one of the most obvious things that you'll encounter right away is that the data portal now no longer requires a criteria object. You can actually pass any serializable value.
Which doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you've done CSLA, it's like, thank you. That makes things so much simpler. So.
You know, I believe, very solid philosophical reasons why the criteria was the right way to go. But ultimately, it comes down to being easier to use without it.
Yes.
So you can still use criteria, and sometimes you have to, but for your common simple object that has a numeric key or something, just being able to pass the numeric value through is it makes life a lot easier.
Okay, so that's one of them.
But actually that's trivial.
Yeah,
in the scheme
it
of
is.
Things, right? I call it out because it's like everybody goes, "Whoa, that's cool." But the real big thing is that the business validation and authorization rules systems are completely replaced with a new system that's much more flexible and powerful.
Which you just put a post on your blog, right? Lhotka.net.
That's right.
Okay.
So in fact, the authorization part is not done. The business rules part and the validation part are in testing at this point, so they're basically done.
Okay.
And the big things here is that rules used to be essentially a static method, and you would point to them using a delegate, which was clever and had some advantages, I suppose. But it's also pretty limiting in that because it's just a method, you can't use object-oriented techniques to describe and implement your rules, to do inheritance, and basically it limits what you can do. So in the new system, rule is actually a class.
Okay.
And when you attach a rule to your business object type, it creates an instance of that class. And so a rule at that point is an actual real-life object. So you can construct rule libraries composed of classes that potentially inherit from each other and create sophisticated rules. But on top of that, the rule can, because it's an object instance at runtime, maintains its own state.
Okay.
So it makes rules it turns out that they're a lot easier to write and a lot easier to make more powerful.
Okay.
Also, you can chain rules, which is, I think, the other really big deal, in that a rule can now invoke other rules. So you can actually create an entire rule engine of your own, or use a commercial third-party rule engine, or use Windows workflow.
Okay.
And all you need to do is create a CSLA rule that runs the workflow, for instance.
Yeah.
gets the results back from the workflow and then convert. You have to put them back into CSLA broken rules. But ultimately, it opens up the door to use all these possible third-party engines and so forth.
So those are the two that I saw you blogged about already. Are there any other ones coming out? Any other little changes, or are those pretty much the big ones?
Well, the authorization rules will be a big deal.
Okay.
Because the current authorization system in, essentially CSLA 1 through 3.8 is all role-based. And the new one will default to being role-based. But I think there's increasing awareness in general about claims-based authorization.
Okay.
I don't think it's really caught on yet, but it's I think it will. So this will open up the avenue for claims-based, but really anything, because now your authorization rules will work exactly the way business rules do. And so you'll be able literally to write your own rule. And if you want to use roles or permissions or claims or, I don't care what you use, CSLA will come with a set of rules that do role-based for... Basically, it'll plug in pretty close to what you have today, but I think it's a big deal.
So, one of the things I've talked to you about before in the past, and you've mentioned is, CSLA has been around now for a long time, even before .NET.
Yeah.
And it seems like you're starting to do things like breaking changes, where release is actually now saying, nobody's either doing this, or if I need to do this change, I got to break something. And I know you have to wrestle with that, because there's people that use something before. If you do change, that will break them. But like you said, you've changed. You didn't say now. I've heard you say before that the 4.0 release, the collection is going to be changed in terms of its base type, right? So that could break some people.
Well, I mean, it's
potentially.
You're right. It's a balance, and ultimately. I've been saving up a lot of breaking changes, things that people have been asking for probably the past 2 or 3 years. I'm like, I'm doing 3.1, 3.5, 3.7. I'm not going to do big changes in a point release because that's I don't think responsible. But this is a major version 3 to version 4.
Yeah.
Also, I think that Windows Forms is basically a legacy technology, and so there's an awful lot of stuff in CSLA that exists out of Windows Forms because of that. That's where data binding was defined. But I think the clear future now is Silverlight and WPF, and at the same time, I think. There's this massive install base of Windows Forms people. So something like you mentioned, I changed all of the base classes for the collections now are observable collections instead of binding lists, which means that they're all friendly with WPF and Silverlight, but they're not so friendly with Windows Forms. So the old classes, like Business List Base, the old one, is now called Business Binding List Base. So it's actually still there. Probably until CSLA 5, I suppose, when I hope to get rid of it completely.
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds like you're doing what I've heard is how you do obsolescence, is you want to give them a path to keep going in a version, but then you want to start giving them like the warning to say, hey, this is going away. This is eventually going to die off, and then finally you just get rid of it. So this seems like at least one step to get there, that it's no longer the default business list base.
Yeah, but I guess nobody should kid themselves because of the business rule changes and the authorization rule changes. There will be work to go from CSLA 3.8 to 4. So it's fairly mechanical, but it's work.
Yeah. So the last question is, and kind of tying with this all, if you could right now, if you didn't have to worry about like a previous install base, and you could just say, from all I know about what has been done, would you have a radically different version of CSLA 1 for 2010? Or would it be fairly similar to what you have right now in CSLA 4? Again, considering that you could just say, bleep the current install base. And I know that there are some things I'd really love to do that would be, for now, for 2010. If you could do CSLA 1 right now, would you have something that looks very different than CSLA 4?
Radically different? No.
Okay.
And the reason being that I still very much believe in the mobile object architecture. and the idea of being able to construct an application so that literally your objects can run on the client, can move to the server, run on the server. But there are definitely things that I would do differently. I think that could be done more elegantly if I didn't have to worry about Windows Forms compatibility or backward compatibility in certain aspects of the data portal. So there are some things that I think would, looking at it, if I could do it from scratch, that would be really, really fun, and I would do. But in the big, no, it would be the same basic concepts and the same basic coding structure.
Okay, cool. All right, let's go find that iPad again.
All right.
Yeah.